There's a misconception that when an empath cuts off their family, it happens in a moment of anger, rebellion, or emotional instability. That idea is not just inaccurate, it completely misses the psychological depth of what's actually taking place. Because for an empath, the decision to walk away from family is rarely impulsive. It is almost always the final stage of a very long internal negotiation. Empaths are typically conditioned early in life to be attuned to the emotional states of others. They learn to read subtle cues, anticipate reactions, and regulate the emotional climate around them. In a healthy environment, this becomes emotional intelligence. But in a dysfunctional one, it becomes survival. And that distinction matters because when empathy is used as a survival strategy, it comes at a cost, the gradual erosion of the self. Over time, the empath becomes a stabilizer in the family system. They are the one who keeps the peace, absorbs tension, smooths over conflicts, and tolerates what others cannot. This role is rarely assigned explicitly. It's reinforced quietly through patterns. When they stay silent, things calm down. When they accommodate, conflict is avoided. When they sacrifice their needs, the system holds together. And so, they learn very early that their value is tied to what they can endure. But endurance has a psychological limit. What begins as compassion slowly turns into chronic self-abandonment. The empath starts overriding their own instincts, ignoring discomfort, dismissing boundaries, rationalizing behavior that would be unacceptable in any other context. They tell themselves stories to make it tolerable. They didn't mean it. They had a hard life. It's just how they are. These narratives aren't naive. They're adaptive. They allow the empath to maintain connection while minimizing internal conflict. The problem is the same narratives also trap them, because every time the empath explains away behavior that harms them, they reinforce a deeper belief that their own emotional experience is negotiable, that their pain is secondary, that maintaining the relationship is more important than maintaining themselves. And this is where the fracture begins. At first, it's subtle, a feeling that something isn't quite right, a sense of fatigue that doesn't go away with rest. Then it becomes more defined: resentment, confusion, emotional numbness. The empath may not immediately recognize these signals because they've spent so long focusing outward, but internally, something is shifting. The system they've been holding together is now starting to collapse inward. What's important to understand is that this isn't just emotional burnouts, cognitive dissonance reaching a breaking point. On one side, there's the belief system they've carried for years. Family is everything. Loyalty is non-negotiable. Love means sacrifice. On the other side, there's their lived experience, repeated hurt, unmet needs, a lack of reciprocity. These two realities can only coexist for so long before the mind demands resolution. And when that resolution comes, it's not dramatic, it's precise. The empath begins to see often for the first time that what they've been calling love may actually be obligation, that what they've labeled as patience might be tolerance of dysfunction, that what they've framed as loyalty has in practice been self-betrayal. This realization doesn't feel empowering at first. It feels destabilizing because if the empath has built their identity around being the one who holds everything together, then stepping out of that role creates a void. Who are they if they're not the one who sacrifices? What happens if they stop managing everyone else's emotions? These are not simple questions. They cut directly into identity, and this is why the breaking point is often delayed for so long. Not because the empath doesn't see what's happening, but because they understand the cost of seeing it clearly. Clarity demands change, and change in this context threatens the entire structure of their relationships. But eventually, the cost of staying becomes greater than the cost of leaving. There comes a moment, quiet, often unspoken, where the empath recognizes that continuing the relationship in its current form is no longer sustainable. Not because they've run out of love, but because they've run out of capacity to abandon themselves. And that distinction is critical. This is not a rejection of others. It is a refusal to continue rejecting oneself. From the outside, it may look sudden. To others, it can appear cold, even unjustified. But internally, this decision has been forming for years. It is the result of accumulated evidence, repeated patterns, and a gradual awakening to the reality of the situation. And once that line is crossed, it's very difficult to go back because the empath is no longer operating from the same belief system. They've seen the dynamic for what it is, and that kind of awareness doesn't easily dissolve. What you're witnessing at that point is not a breakdown, it's a recalibration, a shift from externally defined worth to internally anchored self respect. It's the moment where empathy, which was once directed almost entirely outward, begins to include the self. And that changes everything. Because when an empath finally recognizes that loyalty without reciprocity is self destruction, they're faced with a choice: continue preserving the system or start preserving themselves. And when they choose themselves, it's not an act of betrayal, it's an act of psychological alignment. And the truth is simple: even if it's uncomfortable, the moment you have to lose yourself to keep a relationship, you're not maintaining connection. You're maintaining a pattern. Once that internal line has been crossed, something fundamentally shifts in how the empath process reality. Up until this point, their attention has been almost entirely person-centered. They've been focused on intentions, emotions, backstories, constantly asking why someone behaves the way they do, and then using that understanding to justify staying. But after the breaking point, the lens changes. The empath begins to move away from individual explanations and toward pattern recognition. And that shift is psychological leverage. Because when you stop analyzing people in isolation and start observing behavior over time across situations, something very different emerges. You begin to see consistency where you once saw exceptions. The isolated incident becomes part of a sequence. The apology becomes part of a cycle. The empath who once filtered everything through compassion now starts filtering through accuracy. This doesn't mean they lose empathy. It means their empathy becomes informed rather than automatic. They start noticing that certain conversations always end the same way, regardless of how carefully they approach them. They see that boundaries are acknowledged verbally but ignored behaviorally. They recognize that moments of warmth are often followed by withdrawal, criticism, or subtle forms of control. What once felt like unpredictable emotional turbulence now reveals itself as a structured pattern, one that operates independently of the empath's efforts to stabilize it. And this is where a critical cognitive shift happens. The question changes from "what did I do wrong" to "why does this keep happening no matter what I do?" That question is disruptive because it removes the illusion of control. As long as the empath believes they can fix the dynamic by adjusting themselves, being more patient, more understanding, more accommodating, they remain psychologically invested in the outcome. But when they see that the pattern persists regardless of their input, they're forced to confront a more difficult reality. This system is not responsive to their growth. That realization can feel disorienting, even threatening, because it challenges a deeply held belief that effort leads to change. In most areas of life, that belief is valid. But in dysfunctional relational systems, effort often leads to reinforcement, not resolution. The more the empath compensates, the more the system relies on that compensation to continue functioning as it always has. So what the empath begins to see is not just behavior, but structure, a recurring loop of tension, accommodation, temporary relief, and then repetition. And once you see a loop, you can't unsee it. The emotional intensity that once obscured clarity starts to lose its grip because the outcome is no longer surprising. Now, here's where it becomes psychologically complex. Recognizing a pattern doesn't immediately dissolve emotional attachment. The empath may still feel love, concern, even responsibility, but those feelings are now running alongside a growing awareness that the relationship as it currently exists is not evolving, and that creates a different kind of tension, not confusion, but conflict between what they feel and what they know. This is the point where many people attempt one final recalibration. They might communicate more directly, set clearer boundaries, or try to articulate the pattern they're seeing. And sometimes this is done with the hope that if they can just explain it well enough, the other person will understand and change. But patterns, especially deeply embedded ones, are rarely disrupted by explanation alone. They're maintained by incentives, by roles, by unspoken agreements that have been reinforced over time. So when the empath steps out of their usual role even slightly, the system often reacts, not necessarily with overt resistance, but with subtle pressure to return to the familiar dynamic. And this is where the empath gains a deeper level of clarity, because now they're not just observing the pattern, they're testing it. They're seeing in real time how the system responds to change. And if the response is consistently a pull back toward the old dynamic, that's data. Not emotional data, but structural data. At this stage, the empath begins to understand something that is both liberating and difficult to accept. The issue is not a lack of communication or a failure of empathy or even a misunderstanding. The issue is that the pattern itself serves a function for the system, and that function does not include the empath's well-being. That's a hard conclusion to reach because it removes the possibility that there's just one more thing they could do to fix it. It closes the loop on the idea that resolution is just one conversation away. And in doing so, it forces the empath to shift from problem solving to decision making. Do I continue participating in a pattern that I now clearly understand, or do I step out of it? That decision is not made lightly. It requires the empath to trust their perception over their conditioning, to prioritize consistency over isolated moments of connection, to accept that insight on its own does not change a system that is not designed to change. And this is where emotional clarity becomes a form of detachment, not coldness, but precision. The empath is no longer reacting to each moment as if it exists on its own. They're seeing it as part of a larger structure. And once you understand the structure, your response becomes more deliberate, less reactive. What's happening here is not emotional withdrawal, it's cognitive alignment. The empath's internal model of the relationship is finally matching the external reality. There's no longer a need to reinterpret, to justify, or to minimize. The pattern speaks for itself. And when that alignment is reached, the next step becomes almost inevitable. Because once you stop seeing people as isolated moments and start seeing the patterns they consistently operate within, you're no longer deciding based on hope. You're deciding based on evidence. And the truth is this. When the pattern is clear, the responsibility shifts. It's no longer about understanding them. It's about deciding what you're willing to continue participating in. By the time the empath reaches this stage, the decision is no longer about whether the pattern exists. That part is clear. The question has shifted into something far more internal and far more difficult to navigate what it means to act on that clarity, because insight on its own is relatively clean. It's analytical, structured, even rational. But action introduces consequence, and consequence is where the psychological weight shows up. This is where the guilt begins to surface, often with a level of intensity that seems disproportionate to the situation. From the outside, it might look like the empath is finally doing something necessary, even healthy. But internally, it can feel like a violation of identity, of values, of deeply ingrained beliefs about what it means to be a good person. And that's not accidental. That guilt has structure. Most empaths are not just emotionally attuned, they're also highly conditioned. They've been shaped over years to associate their worth with their ability to maintain connection, to preserve harmony, to absorb discomfort without disruption. In many cases, this conditioning is reinforced by cultural narratives that elevate family to a position of unquestioned priority. The idea that family must be tolerated, preserved, and protected regardless of the cost is rarely challenged. It's presented as moral truth. So when the empath considers stepping away, they're not just evaluating a relationship, they're confronting an entire framework of meaning. And within that framework, leaving doesn't register as a neutral act. It registers as betrayal. This is what creates the guilt trap. It's not simply an emotional reaction. It's a collision between two internal systems. On one side, there's the emerging clarity, the recognition of patterns, the understanding that the relationship is not sustainable, the awareness that staying comes at a psychological cost. On the other side, there's the inherited belief system that loyalty is absolute, that endurance is virtuous, that walking away is a failure of character. When these two systems collide, the empath experiences cognitive and emotional dissonance. They know what they see, but they question whether they're allowed to act on it. And this is where self-doubt becomes particularly insidious, because it doesn't show up as a clear objection. It shows up as a series of subtle questions. Am I overreacting? What if I'm the problem? What if I regret this? These questions don't resolve the situation. They prolong it. They keep the empath suspended in a state of indecision, where clarity exists but action is delayed. There's also another layer at play here, one that operates beneath conscious awareness, the trauma bond. When a relationship involves cycles of tension and relief, moments of conflict followed by reconciliation, it creates a powerful psychological attachment. The inconsistency itself becomes reinforcing. The empath learns to associate relief with connection, even if that connection is unstable or conditional. So when they consider leaving, they're not just stepping away from pain, they're also stepping away from the intermittent reward that's been embedded in the relationship. And that creates a withdrawal effect, not metaphorical psychological. The absence of that cycle can feel disorienting, even empty. This is why the empath may feel pulled back, even after reaching a clear decision. Not because the clarity was wrong, but because the nervous system is still calibrated to the old pattern, and recalibrating that system takes time. What complicates this further is the way guilt is often reinforced externally. Family members may respond to the empath's distance with confusion, criticism, or attempts to reestablish the previous dynamic. This doesn't always come in the form of direct confrontation. It can be subtle expressions of disappointment, reminders of obligation, references to shared history. Each of these signals serves to reactivate the empath's conditioning, and if the empath hasn't fully restructured their internal framework, those signals can be effective. They can trigger a return to old roles not because the empath has changed their mind, but because the pressure to conform feels more immediate than the long-term cost of staying. So the real work at this stage is not just behavioral, it's cognitive. It involves examining the beliefs that are generating the guilt, rather than treating the guilt itself as evidence that the decision is wrong. Because guilt in this context is not a reliable indicator of morality. It's an indicator of conditioning. The empath has to begin separating these two things. They have to ask, is this guilt coming from a violation of my values or from a challenge to the rules I've been taught to play? That distinction is critical because if the guilt is rooted in outdated roles, then acting against it is not unethical, it's necessary. This requires a redefinition of what loyalty actually means, not as blind endurance, but as alignment with what is sustainable and reciprocal. It requires a shift from external validation to internal coherence, from asking, how will this be perceived, to asking, is this consistent with what I now understand to be true? And that's not an easy shift. It involves tolerating discomfort, uncertainty, and at times isolation. Because when you step outside of a longest established dynamic, you're no longer operating within familiar feedback loops. The reassurance that once came from maintaining the role is no longer there, but something else begins to take its place. Something quieter but more stable, a sense of internal consistency, the recognition that your actions are no longer in conflict with your awareness. And over time, that consistency reduces the intensity of the guilt, not by suppressing it, but by replacing the framework that created it. What the empath eventually sees is that the guilt was never about the act of leaving. It was about the fear of becoming someone they were taught not to be. And once they realize that the version of themselves they're stepping into is actually more honest, more grounded, and more aligned, that fear starts to lose its authority. At that point, the decision becomes less about escape and more about integrity, not a rejection of others, but a refusal to continue participating in a system that requires self-neglect to function. And the key insight here is simple, but it carries weight. Feeling guilty doesn't mean you're doing something wrong. It often means you're doing something unfamiliar. What follows after the decision is made is often misunderstood both by the people around the empath and by the empath themselves. There's an assumption that once distance is created, the hard part is over. But in reality, this is where a different kind of work begins, quieter, less visible, but far more transformative. Because when you remove yourself from a system that defined your role for years, you're not just losing connection. You're losing a structure that shaped your identity, and that absence forces a reconstruction. For most empaths, boundaries were never the starting point. They were the missing element. Their orientation was outward, toward understanding, accommodating, stabilizing. So when they begin to establish boundaries, it's not just a behavioral adjustment, it's a reorganization of how they relate to themselves. At first, those boundaries can feel unnatural. Even when they are clearly justified, there's a lingering sense of discomfort. The empath may second-guess their decisions, question their tone, or feel the urge to explain themselves repeatedly. This is residual conditioning. It's the echo of a system where their needs required permission, where asserting themselves risked conflict or withdrawal. So the initial phase of rebuilding isn't about confidence, it's about consistency, repeating the boundary even when it feels uncomfortable, holding the line even when there's no immediate reinforcement. Over time, that repetition begins to create something the empath may not have experienced before, a stable sense of internal authority, and that changes how they perceive connection. Because once you've experienced relationships where your presence is contingent on your compliance, it's easy to confuse attachment with acceptance. You start to believe that being needed is the same as being valued. But as the empath rebuilds, they begin to see the difference. They recognize that true connection doesn't require constant adjustment, that respect doesn't need to be negotiated, and that closeness without reciprocity is not closeness, it's dependence. This shift is subtle, but it's foundational. It moves the empath from seeking validation to evaluating alignment. Instead of asking, "Do they approve of me?" they start asking, "Is this dynamic sustainable for me?" That question introduces a new standard, one that is internally defined rather than externally imposed. And with that standard comes a different kind of strength, not the kind that absorbs impact, but the kind that prevents unnecessary impact from occurring in the first place. It's a proactive form of stability. The empath is no longer waiting to see how a situation unfolds before responding. They're assessing it in real time using their awareness as a filter. Now, it's important to be precise here. This is not about becoming closed off or detached from others. In fact, the empath's capacity for connection often becomes more refined, not reduced, but it's no longer indiscriminate. It's selective. It's guided by patterns, by consistency, by whether the other person can meet them at a level that doesn't require self-neglect. And that selectivity can initially feel like isolation, because when you raise your threshold for what you're willing to participate in, fewer people naturally meet that threshold. The familiar dynamics that once filled your time are no longer available, and the new ones haven't fully formed yet. This creates a gap, a period where the empath is no longer embedded in the old system, but not yet anchored in a new one. That gap is often misinterpreted as loneliness, but is more accurately described as space to recalibrate, to observe without immediate involvement, to build a relationship with oneself that isn't mediated by constant external input. In that space, something important happens. The empath begins to experience themselves without the pressure to perform a role. They're no longer the mediator, the absorber, the one who fixes. And without those roles, there's an opportunity to ask a different question. Who am I when I'm not managing everyone else? That question doesn't have an immediate answer. And that's the point. It opens a process rather than closing one. It allows for exploration, for redefining preferences, values, and limits without the interference of old expectations. Over time, this leads to a more integrated sense of identity, one that includes empathy but is not dominated by it, one that values connection, but not at the expense of self-respect. And from that place, the empath can begin to form relationships that are not based on compensation, but on compatibility. These relationships look different. They don't require constant monitoring. There's less volatility, less need for interpretation. Communication is more direct because there's less fear of destabilizing the connection. And perhaps most importantly, there's reciprocity, not in a transactional sense, but in a structural one. Both people are contributing to the stability of the dynamic. This is where the idea that love requires proximity starts to dissolve. The empath understands that emotional alignment is not determined by physical closeness or shared history, but by how consistently two people can engage without compromising themselves. And in some cases, that means maintaining distance from those who cannot meet that standard, even if they are family. That decision, once difficult, becomes clearer over time. Not because the empath becomes indifferent, but because they become grounded. Their sense of self is no longer dependent on maintaining connections that destabilize them. They can hold complexity care for others without re-entering harmful dynamics. Acknowledge history without being bound by it. And that's the transformation. Not a rejection of empathy, but a refinement of it. Directed not only outward, but inward, balanced by discernment, anchored in boundaries that are no longer negotiable. At that point, peace is no longer something they have to earn. It becomes the baseline from which they operate, and anything that consistently disrupts that baseline is no longer automatically accommodated. It's evaluated. So what you see from the outside might look like distance, but what's actually happening is precision. The empath is no longer available for every connection, only the ones that align with who they've become. And the final realization is